for this opportunity to share a little bit of my research and some of my teaching at the University of Miami. Sheikh Vinay was very kind with the introduction. Right after he got off the stage, I wrote him a text message telling him, "You killed it. That was amazing. That was great." His critique of liberalism is something that really is important to me, because that is something that I need in my own development. I am one of those individuals who was raised in this liberal tradition and hasn't fully deconstructed what that means to my own psyche. So I was just like, I need to read Sherman Jackson. I need to read what you're reading. I need to see that critique that is launched against liberals who have been described as, I guess the definition of a liberal is someone who's so open-minded that their brain has fallen out. And I immediately thought of myself in that with my second book. He mentioned Opposing the Imam. The second one, Dr. Alex didn't mention it, so I'm mentioning it myself. Caliphate and Imamate, available at all bookstores, fine bookstores everywhere. And it's one in which we asked, my co-author and I, Hassan Ansari, ask what makes a legitimate caliph? What makes a rightful imam? And we provide an anthology for the first time in the English language that tells you these answers according to the Ash'aris, according to the Mu'tazilis, according to the Ibadis, according to the Zaydis, according to 12 Shi'is. We look at Sheikh al-Tusi and his Talkhis al-Shafi, and according to Ismailis. So I have a few copies that I can share, that I can sign and provide for those who are interested. But today's talk is not about that. It's entitled Atheists Who Love Religion, Anti-Theism, and Debates About God. I teach a course on atheism that considers two related themes: the reason for which atheism rejects belief in God in the supernatural, and how we can understand skepticism about the concept of God to be a long tradition that can be traced back many centuries. Atheism is thus both a rejection of religious belief and a religion-like tradition of its own. Because believers formed societies that were hostile or intolerant towards non-believers, atheists usually express their views through the types of questions that they ask, rather than openly declare their heretical beliefs. Rather than openly say, it seems kind of weird to believe in an all-powerful God with the ability to stop all evil, a skeptic or a non-believer would ask, if God exists, why does unspeakable pain, suffering, and evil exist at the same time? Believers can ask the very same questions. The difference is that believers may ask with great confidence that God exists and that there's a compelling answer out there. Some will claim that this answer is simple. Some will say that it's mysterious. Others will say that it's complex. But believers will agree that the real answer is one that God knows and that we can grasp only occasionally as humans. By contrast, non-believers ask these questions as part of a process that has led them to the conclusion that this concept of God has too many problems and there are too many gaps. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who died in 270 BC, was one example of someone who famously voiced his skepticism about the concept of God, because he deduced that the existence of such a being would theoretically lead to a non-existence of evil, or that otherwise the concept of God would be very limited and contradictory to popular stories of a creator that keeps a watchful eye and engages in divine intervention. Epicurus famously asks about divine intervention this way: is God both able and willing? Then whence come evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? The early 19th century English poet Percy Shelley similarly asks, if God is infinitely good, what reason should we have to fear him? If he is infinitely wise, why should we have doubts concerning our future? If he knows all, why warn him of our needs and fatigue him with our prayers? If he is everywhere, why erect temples to him? And of course, we know the teaching of the Prophet that Allah has made the earth my masjid, right? So it's not just the temples, the synagogues, the masajid, but the entire earth. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Another reason for which skeptics doubt the existence of God, like the presence of evil, is the presence of a diversity in religions. If the God of one of those religions actually existed, wouldn't that God prevent the continuation of false religions or false sects within a particular religion, so that people who decide to worship God will worship the right one? Why allow the universe to continue for thousands of years without resolving this diversity, at least for those who care to seek God? Why not make one true religion unique both in its strength of its claims and the evidence it provides, so that it is compelling for a critical thinking adult and it can be differentiated from false religions? Since seekers would then recognize the strength of its evidence and arguments, they'd gravitate toward that religion, regardless of the country or the continent that they live in. This is, in fact, the claim that Muslims make about Islam. This is, in fact, the claim that Christians make about Christianity. But when we look at the evidence, they all seem to resemble one another in arguing that they have a particular book that represents the Word of God and a number of miracles associated with holy men and women that occurred in their community, proving this claim to be true. And so we're right back to square one. We have multiple religions making parallel claims and who appear to appeal to the same type of evidence, right? This appeal to supernatural events, the strong inner conviction of prophets and early believers in their community who are touched by God, and then the testimony of informants about the past or about that supernatural world. And so the short of it is that there are two timeless questions that have confounded believers and non-believers alike. How can evil exist when there's this omnipotent being who doesn't desire evil? And if God exists, why is there such diversity in religion? And why do most people follow the religion of their culture? In discussing this question in my courses at the University of Miami, we first start off with key vocabulary. And I think this question of definitions and vocabulary was very important. That's something that we saw yesterday when we were considering other questions. For example, or on Friday when we were talking about shafa and intercession and what that means at another venue, at Emmanuel College. But let's turn to some key vocabulary here. What are anti-theists? Anti-theists are those atheists or non-believers who actively oppose religion and work toward a world without religion, without the phenomenon of religion. Agnostics are people who emphasize the uncertainty in questions about God's existence and often claim that it's unknowable. I'd say there's a common myth about agnostics, and that is that they are people who sit right in the middle and claim that the probability of God's existence and non-existence is 50-50. I would say that that is not agnosticism, and that is not an agnostic. Let's rid ourselves of that misconception. The key feature of agnostics is their epistemology. The idea that all of the evidence for God doesn't yield certainty. That is an agnostic, someone who says that there is uncertainty in all of this regarding the existence of God or the non-existence of God. You can be an agnostic who's uncertain and believe that there is a good chance that God exists, right? You would say that the probability is more than 50%. But because you say that you are unsure and that you might believe that humans don't have the tools to be 100% sure about this, then you would be an agnostic who is 99% sure that God doesn't exist, or that God exists. And so with that element of uncertainty, you're an agnostic who is a believer, who has faith. And faith meaning you trust, you believe, you are taking a leap of faith in the existence of God. There are also agnostics who say that we can't know this answer, and they are 99% sure that God does not exist. And so for that person, they would be an agnostic with atheist leanings. And as it was discussed by Sayyid Rizvi, Richard Dawkins himself puts himself in that category. He can't say that he is 100% sure God doesn't exist. And in fact, he recognizes that it is impossible for an atheist to claim such a thing. He would say that they are being dogmatic in a way that is irrational, and in the way that they critique someone on the other side of the spectrum who is 100% sure in God's existence and says that it can be proven to anyone. They would say both ends of the spectrum are problematic. And of course, for the believer, one can say you can have 100% certainty within your own heart, but that is something that you cannot fully put into words and convince someone else of when you have that 100% certainty because you have witnessed things or because you have experienced things, right? And that's okay, that's different. There's also the term freethinker. And I would say this is an ambiguous term, right? It generally refers to people who form their opinions about the universe without believing in complete obedience to any religious authority. Sheikh Vinay pointed to the fact that in a post-Enlightenment period, there has been a widespread shift in cultures in a postmodernist society where people have become quite skeptical of the authority of ulama or the authority of religious figures. And a freethinker in the pre-modern period was very similar. They were very skeptical of the claims of prophets. They were very skeptical of the claims of religious authorities. But they didn't necessarily disbelieve in God. And so free thinkers in history included Ibn al-Rawandi and Abu Bakr al-Razi. It's an ambiguous term when you say that they are a zindiq or that they are some sort of free thinker. Did they believe in God? Did they believe in God or not? That is unclear. But what is certain is that they didn't believe in religious authorities among themselves. And today in the Muslim world, there are free thinkers who believe in God, but because they have certain tensions with the ulama in their community, they are sometimes portrayed as non-believers, or they are sometimes accused of atheism when that's not the case. It's just that they have, you could say, beef, if that was the word that Alex mentioned before, with certain figures in their community. And then there is the skeptic, someone who withholds judgment until sufficient evidence is available. And so again, Sayyid Rizvi mentioned Bertrand Russell, who viewed himself as a skeptic. He said, look, I am going to withhold judgment on this issue until sufficient evidence is provided to me that this thing exists, whether we're talking about God or something else related to the supernatural. A theist is someone who believes in the existence of a supernatural deity. Hopefully that's clear, that's a beginning point. An atheist, it's from the Greek a, theos, right? A means without, and theos meaning God, is someone who does not believe in God. Or you could say someone who simply lacks belief in a deity. So lacking belief in a deity doesn't necessarily mean that you are claiming that you can prove the non-existence of that deity. You can be someone who simply just didn't grow up with those beliefs, right? And so atheism can have a neutral connotation to it. An atheist can have, I could say, one of three attitudes towards religion. They can have a negative view of it, they can have a positive view of it, and they can have a neutral view of it. The negative one is the one that's previously mentioned, that they are an anti-theist, someone who opposes religion, who opposes theism because they believe it's harmful. And I think the term that people have used earlier is militant atheism to refer to that. But what about the one who has a positive view of religion? Religious atheists might include Buddhists, Unitarians, Jains, who keep their religious identities, or Jews, who keep their religious identities and philosophies without believing in God, in a God or in a deity. And there are those who have a more or less neutral view, and I would say perhaps they are a post-theist, one who believes questions about God don't matter anymore. And again, this is something that has come up again when Sheikh Vinay was providing his presentation. This person would say that we humans are preoccupied with debates about God's existence in the past, but this debate is no longer a meaningful one. Right? And so attachment to a particular religion isn't meaningful. It could have benefit for some, it can be harmful for others, but they don't put themselves as saying that religion is necessarily one or the other. And so we've defined the types of humans that may exist on this question of God, but when we talk about the concept of God, we should also define what we are talking about. And here I want to turn to the God hypothesis, so to speak. I'd argue that the term denoted a supernatural creator or a conscious, intelligent agent. The term also denoted a deity that was worthy of worship and whom humans should petition in prayer. And so when we talk about the God hypothesis, it's a hypothesis that posits that there exists a supernatural and superhuman agent who deliberately designed and created the universe and everything in it, including us. And so what does that mean? When we say supernatural, we're saying that beyond this physical world, beyond this universe that we occupy, there is an unseen world, right? Beyond matter and energy and the life that has been given to us as animals or as plants, beyond this natural world, which we can study through physics or chemistry and biology, there is the supernatural. There is the ghaib, the unseen world. If someone is a naturalist or a materialist, they would be opposed to this supernaturalist worldview. They would say there's only this physical world. And so when you believe in the God hypothesis, you posit that there are supernatural causes. There is an agent or agents that represents the answer to why something exists. And so the God hypothesis in the ancient and medieval world held that God was the creator and, as Sheikh Subhani mentioned, the designer of the universe and all life. God is the supernatural cause to why good things or good fortune can occur to people. God was also the supernatural cause for why natural disasters befell a city or a nation. God was the cause for miracles that saved a community from destruction. God was the source for when Jesus with his two hands is able to give vision to someone who is blind, and so on. In being a superhuman and intelligent agent, this denotes the idea that God is more powerful and knowledgeable when compared to humans, right? More powerful meaning a human cannot end God's existence, but the opposite is true. And it's for this reason that ancient societies recognize this hierarchy between themselves. And they recognize many hierarchies, right? That the free folk were higher than the enslaved, that men were higher than women. And so they recognize that kings were higher than laypersons or subjects. And so they recognize that the King of Kings in this God hypothesis was some power that was beyond, that was superior to humans. He was the wisest and most powerful agent in the universe. God was immortal and eternal, never weakened by age or fatigue. And so in being the wisest being, God is the source of scripture, right? Books with the answers that we need for guidance. And so it's for all of these reasons that the deity was viewed as definitely worthy of worship. Now, for believers in the God hypothesis, God created this universe and human life with a grand purpose in mind. And I think that's, again, a very important distinction between an atheist and a theist. That an atheist or someone who lacks belief in God will say, well, things will exist just because. Right? There is no purpose, or ultimate meaning to the existence of the universe. It just exists. In the way that fire just burns and two hydrogen molecules and an oxygen molecule is water, it just is, right? And so for a believer, they'll say no, that there is a grand purpose in mind, that God does not create the universe out of futility. Right? Someone would say that purpose could be to experience love, to worship God, to know God, to experience bliss in heaven, and so on. And so for a person of faith, there is a deliberateness in all creation, right? And this is of course spoken of in the Quran. And so it's with that introduction we turn to what is not part of the God hypothesis. The argument that atheists make is that when you have individuals who retreat from the God hypothesis, and they provide alternative, less objectionable conceptions of God. As again, Sheikh Vinay mentioned, individuals who create a religion that is just soothing for themselves. They stretch the meaning of words until they retain scarcely anything of their original sense. By calling God some vague abstraction which they've created for themselves, they pose as deists, as believers before the world, and they may even pride themselves as having attained a higher and purer idea of God, but their God is nothing but an insubstantial shadow and no longer the mighty personality of religious doctrines. The point here is that you've had deeply critical thinkers who identify as believers in God retreat from the God hypothesis in different ways. They've, for example, recognized that, well, the God of the Hebrew Bible and the Quran seems to resemble a tribal God where, you pray to that deity and they take their side against other tribes, thinking again of the Hebrew Bible and the Israelite God versus these other tribes that existed in the ancient Near East. And so people have tried to rethink what that, how they can have a God that doesn't fit that model. And when they retreat from that God hypothesis, they understand that, for example, if God is completely transcendent and isn't involved in who wins the next soccer or football game, or who wins the next war, or so on, that when one engages in prayer, it's a symbolic activity where you are sharing your concerns with this deity without expecting intervention, because this deity is completely transcendent. And so the argument that atheists and even traditional ulama have made is that when you retreat from that concept of God, you have lost its original meaning, and that it no longer upholds the doctrines and beliefs that previous believers held in regards to God. And to sum up, there are three lessons I'd like us to draw from this talk. First, that there are anti-theists, those who are strongly opposed to the phenomenon of religion and the concept of God. And there are atheist practitioners of religion who view religion as a positive vehicle of spiritual practices that help with human well-being. There are classical doctrines about God in this God hypothesis that modern progressive believers retreat from because they recognize that there are some tensions and problems, and they begin to portray that God as a non-interventionist God. And there are traditional practitioners of religion who would say that is not God that you are worshiping when you do this. Lastly, I'd like to turn to the fact that there are atheist practitioners of religion and spirituality, and within the Islamic tradition, they have been viewed as individuals who've rejected Islam, and so most theologians have considered unbelievers who've refused conversion to Islam to be doomed. And they typically understood such individuals as doing this as a result of arrogance and pride. However, they also recognized that some of these unbelievers engaged in what theologians called nadhar, careful examination of Islamic doctrines. And according to one theologian, I've only found one in the early period, one Mu'tazili theologian, he said, if someone engages in careful examination of Islamic doctrine, they exerted great effort in their search for the truth, but came to the conclusion that Islamic doctrines were false, that it would not befit God's wisdom to punish the latter when they've committed no offense, no jurm. Their responsibility was to carefully consider the existence of God and their duties to such a creator, and they sincerely attempted to fulfill this duty. God would judge such individuals who exerted great effort in seeking the truth to be excused, ma'dhur. We know this because God states, God does not create hardship and adversity in his religion or such an impossible situation for his creation, and God doesn't create such adversity or impossible situations for one with sight, for one who has been paralyzed, or for one who's facing illness. Otherwise, it would be considered taklif ma la yutaq, the imposition of a duty on one who's unable to fulfill the duty. Or that person would fall under the category of people that scholars have termed insufficiently equipped to recognize the truth of Islam, mustad'af or mustad'afun. And so the Arabic is من بالغ في الطلب والنظر واستفراغ المجهود ولم ينل المقصود. زعم الجاحظ, this Mu'tazili theologian, أنه معذور إذ لا يليق بحكمة الحكيم أن يعذبه مع بذل الجهد والطاقة من غير جرم وتقصير. كيف وقد قال الله تعالى وما جعل عليكم في الدين من حرج وليس على الأعمى حرج ولا على الأعرج حرج ولا على المريض حرج. جزاكم الله خير.